Okay, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, Succeed with Your Copilot Rollout. So we have a lot to get through today. We're going to spend a little bit of time on introductions, and then we're going to go into the current state of AI and Copilot here in 2025. We'll take a quick look at some of the common mistakes that people have made on their Copilot rollouts that we've seen, and then walk through for our experience, what are the best steps to take when you are structuring your Copilot rollout project. This is a technique that I helped develop during my tenure at Microsoft as we launched multiple customer early adoption programs. So we'll start with how to plan and prepare, how to get your content in line, most importantly, the structure of your Copilot program, and how you transition that into a rollout phase and then hand that off into production. So let's get started with introductions. Two questions that are frequently raised that I added in the chat just as we get underway is today's webinar is being presented by Synozur using Teams webinar. And so that means two things. First, today's webinar is being recorded and we will release the recording as well as the deck within the next 24 hours after this. So watch your email for when that comes out. Secondly, Teams webinar does not let our guests come off camera or go on mic, but if you have a question, use the Q&A feature, and you should be able to share that just fine. Let's keep going. So just a little background on me. I'm not going to read this, but my name is Chris McNulty. I head up strategic markets at Synozur. Prior to Synozur, I spent the better part of the last 10 years as a senior director of product marketing for content management at Microsoft. Overseeing with my team technologies like SharePoint and OneDrive and Viva and of course Copilot. So it's great to be able to be here with you all this morning and share some of the things that I've learned during that journey. And today's webinar is being produced by Synozur. So Synozur is a boutique advisory firm, essentially a management consulting organization. And we focus on understanding the problems of business and being able to use tools of culture to impact your organization to make sure that your strategy, whether it's operational, go to market, general, technological, are all being properly embedded in your culture with the right processes and plans to be able to help you achieve business success. And we'll have more details about how to get engaged with us at the end of today's webinar. And these are just some of the clients that Synozur has serviced over the years. We're very proud of this and happy to be able to offer our services to the community as a whole this morning. As we get started, I wanted to take a few minutes just to look at the current state of AI in 2025. I don't have to tell folks that the world is rapidly evolving, both in the world of business and in the world of technology. Generative AI has really upended a lot of traditional assumptions about how products should be formed, what does employee experience look like, what's a great interface. And technology is a key lever to help organizations take advantage of all these potential improvements in productivity. I like to say that we are in the midst of the third wave of digital transformation. Now, I know that that is a phrase that has been overused over the past decade, but digital transformation, the first wave was really about moving workloads into the cloud. And in that wave, we weren't changing what people were doing so much as taking a mail server, for example, that may have been in a closet down the hall and moving it to the cloud. There were operational and financial advantages, but we're not yet there for doing transformative things. The second wave, which kicked off around, say, 2017, is when we started to see brand new workloads that were native to the cloud emerge, things that would never have been possible during on-premises workloads. And so that's where you start to see things like Teams come to the forefront. That second wave is about starting to take advantage of the workloads that have been moved to the cloud and how can we interconnect them with the power of these massive data centers behind them. In that wave, we also saw the rise of much more intensity of cloud information that was accelerated certainly by all the pushes for remote work that were occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. So this third wave, though, is very much the generative AI wave. And it is still, in relative terms, early. So we're working out all the permutations and repercussions and advantages and risks for generative AI. There is so much content that lives in the cloud. Close to 3 billion net new documents a day are added to Microsoft 365 alone. Generative AI has a tremendous ability to be able to harness that information, to make sense of it, and to help you create new insights with the information that you have that's unique to your organization. But obviously, doing that needs to be balanced against the proper controls to manage risk and manage security, as well as external interoperations with other companies and with regulatory authorities. Microsoft, about 5 years ago, started a think tank called the Work Lab. And the Work Lab every year publishes something called the Work Trend Index. And historically, it's looked at topics like remote work, hybrid work, employee experience. And over the past 2 years, understandably, Microsoft has spent a lot of time looking at the impacts of AI on the workforce. The Work Trend Index is based on a research cohort of over 30,000 people across over 30 countries and is looking at their interactions qualitatively and quantitatively, signals Microsoft gets from its own services, as well as research that it does with academic institutions and analyst firms around the world. Let's unpack a couple of those data points and so you can see where you are. Microsoft has tremendous potential. Based on their research, 70% of people exposed to it say they're more productive with Copilot, and almost as many say it improves the quality of their work. Those are high goals. We also are seeing people saying they're much faster being able to get caught up on a meeting they weren't able to attend, and also faster being able to do a series of tasks to find information, develop it, and summarize it. But that doesn't come automatically. Um, Looking at both management as well as employees, being involved with AI requires a new set of skills. I've said before, generative AI tools like Copilot turn everyone in your organization into a manager, at least of one thing, which is your AI Copilot. It's best to think in many ways of systems like Copilot as being a really eager, bright, and not very experienced college intern. So you get quality from Copilot based on the quality of what goes into it. And it requires new skills to be able to explain what you want from the system, being able to analyze and use judgment to figure what you're getting out from it, what's accurate and what's not. That does not happen automatically. Turning on Copilot without any preparation, planning, or readiness across your content and your workforce is going to lead to a situation where people are disappointed. We'd like to help you avoid that. There are some fairly lofty numbers that Microsoft has published about the use of AI in the workforce. Over 3/4 of knowledge workers are using AI in some way, shape, or form, but an awful lot of that is unmanaged. And just because you're using ChatGPT to compose a poem for your colleague's birthday card doesn't really mean that you've had an impact on the way that people are doing work. So a lot of those tools are being unmanaged, and there are quality as well as security risks without being able to put the right controls in place, as well as optimize your experience with the right information. Certainly, cybersecurity and data privacy are parts of those top of mind issues. And based on some further research, looking at folks like many of you who are being charged with deploying systems like Copilot in your organization, the experience that's out there doesn't necessarily match those Microsoft numbers. About half of the folks that we've spoken to in our research last year had little or no experience themselves or across the organization with managing that. A lot of that information is coming from outside. And according to research about 9 months ago, published in the New York Times, less than 5% of US organizations are using AI effectively and at scale. There's a lot of pilots, there's a lot of experiments, but today we're going to look at how we get out of that. We've written about this extensively. We think that there are going to be major changes in the AI world throughout 2025. And just very briefly, just to prepare you for this and why getting started with Copilot helps address some of these areas, are what's called Omni AI integration, green AI, working anxiety, as well as personal chatbots. And I'll just speak about each of those in turn. Systems like Copilot work best with the data that lives in Microsoft 365. And every vendor that's out there has been adding interfaces to their software. And so you can certainly see a case where to be able to construct a full picture of a customer requires looking at Copilot and then jumping over to Salesforce and asking it what it knows, jumping into SAP, going to ServiceNow, etc. That task switching is the latest phase of what happens when systems are not properly integrated. Omni AI, as an industry driver, is about integrating both the content on the back end so that AI can reason over it, as well as the chat interfaces to be augmented with indexes and agents so that fundamentally you ask one question and you get one answer. Secondly, green AI. It is shocking how much power and how rapidly power demands on data centers are growing with all of the new wave of generative AI. That data growth is happening at about a 44% annual growth rate. It is projected over the next 2 years to reach 146 terawatt hours. That is enough to power 300 million homes for a day. And there are not 300 million homes in the United States. So 3 to 5% of all the power in the world is going to be going to AI. That's a lot of impact. And so there is increasing concern to look at things like carbon dioxide use. How can we optimize and select technologies that have minimal environmental impact, as well as how can new vendors emerge to make those queries and that compute time much more efficient. So that's a second trend to watch. The other two trends are things that are just things to be mindful of that I don't think are going to be running at scale in the workplace. So we've all heard about the agentic future and all of these autonomous agents that will be able to replicate employee skills. There's a lot of fear that's out there. Studies by EY have shown nearly 2/3 of the workforce has some anxiety that AI is going to replace them. However, these tools and tasks take a while to become effective. Not all of them are going to work. So the challenge in 2025 is less about managing the deployment of skills-based agents. It's even more managing the expectations of your workforce. The last, there's a collision happening between personal knowledge tools, such as character.ai, as well as business knowledge tools. So there's a lot that you can do with creating AI chatbots that sound like you. You can now use Copilot Studio to map into content that represents you, whether it's in your OneDrive, being able to integrate things like Ancestry.com or LinkedIn. So these, you're going to hear a lot about those, but in our estimation, despite all the attention and growth rates, they're going to stay a lab curiosity in 2025. Okay. One of the things that we've seen are what are some of the most common mistakes that organizations make in their Copilot deployment? And this is just a collection of some of the things that happen. There are all too many organizations that get a limited number of licenses, 500 licenses, say, and they throw them out to their executive tier, thinking that it's a privilege, we want this to give it to these people. The training is non-existent, the usage is spotty, there's no policing of what content it's reasoning over, is it the right content or not? And after 3 months of letting the executives play with it with varying degrees of success, all the licenses get bought, and the tool that's used to run the rollout is email, announcing, ta-da, March 1st, you all have Copilot and good luck. If you've seen these in organizations that you know, you're not alone, and we're here to help you avoid some of these mistakes. So the tools and techniques I'm going to show you are based on a 5-step, 5-stage plan for how to approach Copilot. Each one has a couple of steps in it, and each one has a different goal. So starting by preparing your organization, the most important thing to do is to gather your stakeholders, to form the right team and steering committee, to figure out what is the scope and vision of what you're doing with Copilot. Don't just turn it on and see what happens, but being able to experiment in this phase to figure out what are the 3 or 4 use cases that you think are most in need and most likely to be successful in your organization. Secondly, is your content ready? Content is what carries the unique ideas and thoughts and creativity and intellectual property of your organization. It what makes each organization different. It what makes you you. But it's important to make sure that your content that's going into Copilot is in the right place. Does it need to be migrated? Does it need to be integrated? Do we need to deal with obsolete content or make sure the content is not being overshared? All of that is hard work, and it's really needed before you start giving people their first taste of what Copilot's going to look like in your organization. Then we move on to the pilot. The pilot is where we figure out how we're going to start working through the organization, being able to pick the right blends of people in the right groups to be able to give them a structured program for them to be exposed to and learn how to work best with Copilot to achieve the goals that you've set up in earlier phases. And it's really about not just creating energy and wisdom, but capturing the learnings that you're going to need. So each phase of the pilot gets successively better, and you can hand that off into a rollout program as well as going into production. So rollout comes next, figuring out how are you going to drive training across the organization, introducing the right communications, and making sure, again, that it's mapped onto those use cases that you set up at the outset. And finally, closeout. The goal of this is a project. A project is by nature a temporary endeavor. So the way that you govern this experimentation, this pilot, and this rollout needs to all be captured and handed off to the right team moving forward for steady state support. And whether you're setting up centers of excellence or communities of practice, making sure that you are handing that off and taking a moment to recognize and celebrate your successes during this. Okay, let's go through each of those phases in more detail. And Michelle, I'm just going to stop and see if there's any questions that have come in the Q&A before we start walking through this.
No questions so far. Yeah, we're clear.
Great, thanks. Okay. So for preparation, again, in preparing, the goal of this phase is to build the right team and create a collective vision for what is the goal for rolling out Copilot in your organization. So in that, some of the most common questions that you should be thinking about asking are, what are the goals that are there? What are the most likely pain points? Where are you today with AI? Do you have a plan for data? Do you have the right resources on the support side? And do you have a way of measuring? The answer to many of these questions may be not yet, which is fine. That's the goal of these projects. But it's important to assess where you are as you start assembling the right team to operate across this organization. And in that, you need to be able to figure out what are the end results that you're going for. And whatever those end business results are, work backwards to how you get there. A business result is not everyone has access to Copilot. A business result is customer presentations can be prepared 50% faster, for example. And so if that becomes one of your goals, because it's a pain point for your organization, that's going to have a lot to do with how you structure your pilot. It's important during this phase. This is a phase where it is perfectly fine to have a small cohort of people who are just experimenting and experimenting and experimenting. This is an ideation phase. And so you may be looking to attend conferences or network with other organizations to find out what they're using to help make sure that your team does not suffer from a lack of imagination. So messy experimentation is fine, but you also have to keep in mind, once you start getting into pilot and once you start getting into deployment, every organization has a natural change rate. And if you were moving faster than the organization can absorb that, you're going to lose people along the way. And so that requires just some honest understanding about what industry you're in, what your workforce is like, what are some of the regions and operations that you have. Rolling out Copilot to a set of digital creators who work in an agency is going to have a different rate of return than rolling out Copilot on a factory floor to workers who may not have even had computer access on a consistent basis until the project started. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing, taking a look at scope. It is tempting, once you start getting underway, to start taking on more than you intended at the outset. And with that, it's important to make sure that you are establishing the right structure. A phrase I like to use is BOPSAT. A bunch of people sit around talking. Talking about Copilot can be fine in small groups, but when it's coming to the project, you want structured agenda, structured activities, and making sure that that is captured so that you can use it for future results and being able to tap into that for future use of tools like Copilot Studio. There are many new Copilot technologies coming up. Some may be appropriate, some may not, but it's important not to be distracted by those squirrels to take you off path from where you're working. So making the team work together is the most important part of this, is to make sure that you are blending technical capabilities as well as business stakeholders. Running Copilot solely through the IT team is going to lead to a Copilot that benefits IT more than anyone else in the organization. And it's hard to justify the budgets required to deploy Copilot to 10,000 people or more if it's not tuned to the needs of the rest of the business. With that, borrowing from agile methodology, and when you look at systems like Scrum, you need to have a vision statement. And so the team that you're assembling should be collaborating on what are the visions and use cases that you're going to use in the rollout. Here's my mouse. So there are temptations, especially if IT is too involved in this, to take some classic methodologies, waterfall methodologies, and bring all the data together into one giant pile, and then use a long-term period to build customized AI models, and then show it to the users at the end. Again, if you think through Scrum type methodologies where you have key stakeholders who have skin in the game, as well as customers who are engaged in these reviews, you're going to be more attuned to delivering things that people will use and that will address their goals. In forming this team and informing the steering committee, this is one thing that I find that's essential. You need a diversity of skills and levels through the organization. So you want to make sure that everyone has some level of representation and that you are blending people who are mostly writers, people who deliver training, people who present. The team that you assemble are going to be the evangelists for Copilot in your organization. So you need to make sure that you have good customer-facing skills in the team that you form. You're going to need some budget for it. It doesn't need to be massive. Copilot licensing can be expensive, and customization and all those things are separate, but it does require some investment of resources to be able to make sure that the deployment project itself is being properly run and is being properly tended. And you should be thinking through, how are you going to support Copilot users throughout? It begins by also making sure you're talking to your help desk, making sure that you've identified the right people, that they know how first line support is going to work. And the reason why is it is proper in most organizations to, in the pilot project, to provide what's called white glove support, so that as you bring in pilot users, folks on your deployment team are the ones who are actually taking on the bulk of the burden of dealing with user questions and issues. However, as the based on the size of your organization, some of those questions are going to find their way to the help desk. And the help desk should not be completely in the dark that this is coming. The work that you're doing, making sure that you're engaging your support teams from the outset, is going to make it much more likely that when you're ready to need support at scale, they're going to be prepared, and you've identified the 5 most common things that customers are going to raise. And the way that you structure your support model in pilot usually predicts how it's going to work once you get to production. And also, throughout the pilot, you need to make sure there is some system to measure issues that are going on. There should be a plan for internal escalation. So if a user hits an issue, making sure that you know where to go internally before going to Microsoft, and making sure that you have tools and systems to capture that. Whether you're using ServiceNow or Zendesk, or even if you're just using the free SharePoint template that Microsoft provides, you want to make sure that all those issues are being captured in a way that builds your knowledge of the best way to solve those issues. When it's time for escalation, Microsoft is putting a lot of resources in Copilot support. I can tell you personally that if you say that the ticket is related to Copilot, you can get a callback sometimes within 5 minutes of raising the ticket. So they're there and they're ready to help, but you want to make sure that not every issue gets escalated to Microsoft. Because when you do that, you're losing the learnings. So in this, make sure that you are not identifying everything. There's a lot of logic saying that Copilot is a Swiss Army knife that can fix everything. That's not true. And trying to run everywhere in every direction all at once is a recipe for disaster. Second, make sure you're thinking about what security and content controls you need as you're forming the team and taking a measured approach to adoption across the organization. Okay. So content readiness is the next phase. So within this, you need to make sure you are looking at the content that you need to answer the questions and interactions that you've identified in the first phase that are part of your use cases. And so with that, the questions that your team should be addressing are: what content do you need? Where does it live? And how do we make sure that we've got the right security, quality, and freshness for it? And so looking at that, there are a couple of data requirements for Copilot. So as I said before, Copilot works with the Microsoft Graph, which is intrinsically applying the content controls that you have for interactive content extended to Copilot. So if your security is good, Copilot's going to be good. If your security is wide open, Copilot's going to find things that you may not expect it to. Data may live beyond Microsoft 365. And so for that, you need to understand where the critical data is. Does it need to stay where it is, or does it need to be integrated or migrated? If you can move something, you're going to have a greater experience inside of it because you're reducing complexity. So move what you can, but integrate the rest. Part of the reason why information lives in some external mission critical system is because it's mission critical. So trying to suggest we should shut down Salesforce and move all its content into M365 because Copilot is better doesn't really service the needs of the people who are using Salesforce to interact with customers and all the great things that Salesforce does. So there are a bunch of integration solutions that you can look at. They may include things like Microsoft Graph connectors, right, using custom code. Copilot plugins and agents can sometimes be implemented, as well as there's an emerging class of third-party solutions. And again, this is not going to be a deep dive on migration, but just to remind you, don't move a mess. If your information, wherever it was living, if it was on premises or in some other legacy system, and it was poorly built and poorly structured, just lifting it from where it was into M365 isn't necessarily going to improve things. The most important thing to make sure you're identifying is ROT, redundant, obsolete, or trivial content. That's information that probably should not be at the core of what you're doing with Copilot. And so looking at content security, there are a number of tools that you can use. And those tools are primarily Purview, SharePoint Advanced Management, Microsoft 365 Archive, and SharePoint Premium for being able to apply classifications and metadata. And so these are some of the tools that you should explore. And the one that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is something called SharePoint Advanced Management. Now, when you are setting up Copilot, you can tell Copilot to look at everything in your organization or a selective list of sites. A restricted search is what that's called. That's one set of tools, but even within your corpus of information, SharePoint Advanced Management provides a lot of key tools to look at things like access policies, ownerless content, overshared content, redundant content, and more. And as of Ignite of last year, it is now included at no additional charge with Copilot. So this is a set of tools that you're going to have for your rollout. Some of the things that advanced management lets you address are things like inactive or ownerless content. Teams and SharePoint site sprawl happens. People leave an organization, and you may have islands of content that you don't even know who owns them, let alone what's inside of those things. So being able to build policies to find that information and determine what should happen to reassign it or mark something as read-only. There's lots of options that you have. It's one of the things that SAM does for you during a readiness period. The second is data access governance. So with this, you can look at what the top sites are with sensitive information based on where they live, how much things are being shared, what those access policies are, and being able to find what parts of your organizational information might be overexposed. And then there are policy tools you can use based on what you're seeing out there. And then restricted access controls allow you to lock down security on some of those sites based on the determinations that you have all along. So let's take a look at what SharePoint Advanced Management looks like operationally. And this is going to be a very quick demo and not a technically deep dive. Okay. So this is the SharePoint Admin Center. If you're a SharePoint admin, you've seen this before. If not, you may not have. And just to show you what is involved with this, I want to take a look at site lifecycle management because we talked about obsolete information before. And so one of the things that you can do with this is determine what should happen when a site goes inactive. So here, I'm going to create a new policy that will build reports and looking for sites if there's been no activity on the site in a period of time that I specify. And I can also say what should happen if that doesn't happen. So in this case, let's set up a new policy for what should happen 2 months. It's fairly aggressive, but I can say, I want you to look at sites that don't have a group or sites that do, or look at everything. So we're going to look at everything. We can filter it. We can determine if we should look at sites with retention policies, if there's sites we want to block. And then the question is, who should be notified if a site has gone inactive? And then what should happen if people, after several notifications, don't do anything? And so you can run this just to generate reports, you can run this to generate alerts, or you can run this to take action. So in this case, let's say we're going to send emails to owners and admins, and we want to enforce something. And that enforcement can be either mark the site as read-only, which may wake people up if they need it, or move the site to archive. And so when you move that to archive, you can start by saying it should be read-only for a few months and then move elsewhere. So you can finish the policy and you have an option of running it in simulation mode. And in simulation mode, you'll get a report of the sites that are in scope, but no one's going to be alerted. And so that's a good step to take before you start to enlist those content owners to help you with what's going on. And there's a lot more that we can do in advanced management, but in the interest of time, we're not going to do a deep dive on all those things. We're on to the pilot phase. And the goal of the pilot fundamentally is to create energy with your first waves of adopters and take their learnings to help guide the rest of the rollout program. So with that, again, picking the right people is important. And it's helpful to find people who work together on common problems because the interaction of two people who are working on the same problems yields much better information than you would get from people who are completely random. And again, in the pilot, you should pick people who are willing. Forcing it, certainly in the early phases, is going to generate learnings that may not be as helpful later on. One thing I particularly recommend is if you have executives in your organization who want in, you may have to include some of them, but an executive who already has a live human administrator is less likely to have a transformed experience because they already have someone that they're asking to take notes and do research and manage things. And so shifting some of those workloads into Copilot isn't going to have the impact on those folks. It's people who don't have administrators. Those individual contributor roles can be very helpful. The second part of this is understanding how are you going to organize the different pilot cohorts. Just throwing people into something and calling it a pilot program is really not a pilot program. One of the things that we learned at Microsoft is the more we approached it academically with a structured curriculum for what people were supposed to do week over week, the better the results were. That structure is helpful to people who are being exposed to technology for the first time. And also make sure that there is persistent communication beyond just a weekly call. There should be those are certainly important, but making sure that for those asynchronous communications or document sharing that you're using the tools that you have, things like Teams, to be able to keep people connected with the pilot group as well as the team and that's running and steering this throughout. mentioned before, you want to make sure you're picking people who have common problems, you're picking people who are willing, and looking for a diversity of roles from across the organization. Because that's how you're going to get the learnings that you need to scale up what you're doing across the board. So this is essential. So one of the things that we found is that based on your use cases, you really should be thinking about constructing a pilot program that's going to run 4 to 8 weeks. And the first week and the last week are fairly standard. And in the middle, well, that can be sort of up to you. But one of the things we found is that when we were rolling out new technologies, whether it was Copilot, whether pieces of Viva, pieces of SharePoint, bringing customers in for a 6-week program and just asking them to call in every week, you got a lot of random experiments the first week, but 3 or 4 weeks in, people didn't know what was expected of them. So the goal of each week is to be able to do a deeper dive into some area based on your use cases where you're looking for both training and interaction and feedback. So in the example I have up on the screen, this is a 6-week rollout. And week over week, the first week, you're going to give people assignments to take a look at teams and give them some guidance as to how to work with Copilot and teams based on what your use cases are. Many organizations do have the use case about using Copilot inside Teams meetings to be able to take notes and ask questions and generate action items, but you want to coach people on that so that when you come back in the second week, you're getting feedback and introducing the next topic, in this case, Word, Outlook, PowerPoint, and the rest. And remember what I said about BOPSAT. These meetings should not just be talking at people and listening to people, but there are lots of tools that are going to be much more successful and more keeping people more engaged in these weekly meetings. If you look at design-led thinking, things like polls and whiteboards and some gamification, moving people to breakout rooms helps people stay engaged. And the communications about this need to be persistent. That means SharePoint and channels. An awful lot of things can get lost in email or in chat because the cohort that you're working with is going to expand over time. It's easier to plug people into persistent communications than into random communications. As you go through each wave that you bring through it, at the end, there's a graduation period. So all members still stay in the program. They don't have to keep going through every loop that you do with the pilots, but they still have access to the tools and the systems. They still have access to office hours. So as they are continuing to use and evangelize, they have a place to be able to come in. And this is also a place, as you get to this graduation, you may want to look at small token thank you gifts, things that are visible. And they can be very simple. They can be custom Teams backgrounds. They can be coffee cups or things that let people take pride in their contribution to what's going out there. So in this example, we're looking at 8 weeks just to make the point that what organizations do is in a pilot may look different inside each organization. So this is an 8-week program, and this presumes that for Contoso, they're going to look at Teams, Word, Outlook, PowerPoint, Excel, and OneNote, fairly conventional. Week 1 is still orientation and training. Week 8 is still graduation. But for Fabricam, they may look at, you'll see Teams is fairly common and Word is fairly common, but getting into some of the more content interactions based on what they're looking to do. So you may spend more time in this organization with OneDrive and SharePoint, starting to maybe look at agents based on what people are doing. The third organization, you may be looking more at the collaborative frontier. So looking at things like Loop and Forms and Copilot chat. Again, all of this is going to be determined earlier on based on your use cases and what parts of the collaboration stack you are trying to leverage to achieve your use cases. And so remember that your user base is going to be growing throughout. So you're going to begin with experimentation in the SteerCo. And that first cohort of pilot users is where you're going to get probably the most correction. You're going to assume what the use cases are and assume what the curriculum is going to be. And based on how that goes, you should be willing and able to adjust that plan as you move into things like the second pilot, the third pilot, as many pilots as you need before you get ready for the rollout phase. And I mentioned this before, I'm not going to play all of these, but there are a number of Microsoft resources that are pre-built that you can use to help drive energy and enthusiasm. So some of these are these launch videos, and I'll just play a split second of these. So these are already out there and available. So you don't necessarily need to invest a ton of creative resourcing. Just leverage what Microsoft has already made. If you're looking at Copilot and you've been studying what Microsoft announces, this is all going to seem familiar and even boring to you. But for your users, they may not have seen any of this before. So leveraging those resources is important. Being able to leverage some of the canned demos that Microsoft has published. Copilot usually has a big impact on people when they see how Copilot runs in meetings. And these demos are available from Microsoft. And again, when I share this deck with you, you'll get access to at least these videos. So you can use something that is much more professional, if you choose to help drive that energy enthusiasm across the pilot program. The other thing is, I talked about structuring the meetings. It is important that the outputs of the pilot are captured in a way that you can use them. And that involves both quantitative progress as well as qualitative measures. And so in these examples, I'm going to assume that you have access to Microsoft Viva. However, there are lots of ways to accomplish these things without Viva. So Viva Insights includes, at no additional charge, a Copilot dashboard, which will tell you how users are actually interacting with Copilot in your organization. And to get to more qualitative measures, you can use surveying tools, you could use Microsoft Forums, or Viva Pulse actually has some standardized questions so you can ask the regular questions in a regular pattern and collect and look at those results. And so quickly, let's take a look at what some of those things look like. So here we are with Viva Pulse. So this is Microsoft Viva. If you have not seen it, these are the elements down the left-hand side. And so by going into Pulse, you'll see that I can build a quick survey that Microsoft calls a Pulse that I want to send to a group of people. And one of the things that's already built for you are Copilot Impact. So you can have these pre-built questions that you'll see. Say, is this improving the quality of my work? Am I spending less information on time? And so you can also take these and you can add a custom question if you want to. I know what I can do with Copilot. So I've added a custom question. And then decide where I want to send this to. So this is where you're going to pick people. You need to have at least 5 people respond. There's a lot of privacy controls built in. Doing a survey that you send just to one person is obvious what they thought of something. So you need a large enough group in your pilot, and you should have enough people to be able to pull that information together and the rules about how they're going to be introduced, and so on and so forth. The other thing that you get, in addition with Insights, so Viva Insights is a tool that's looking at employee experience and looking all up at how people are interacting with each other and with collaboration tools. And it's the vehicle, without buying the full Viva Insights license, that gives you the Copilot dashboard. So just opening up the Copilot dashboard, you can see how is Copilot existing in my organization? What are some of the potential ways that people have been reporting on the usage? And then just start to drill into what you're actually seeing inside the organization. And so we're a fairly small group, so we have we're fairly privacy restricted, but this is just showing you that you can see how people are actually using Copilot, how many hours they're saving, where are people actually using it for things like meetings or Teams chat and so on and so forth. So a little bit of just the free tooling that Microsoft makes available to you to be able to measure the success of your pilot project. As you go through pilots, ultimately you do want to get to the rollout phase. And the goal of rollout is to introduce Copilot to the users who need to achieve the results that you defined at the use cases, the outset. And so with that, you should really be focusing on what are the winning scenarios. If you've gone through and identified 6 use cases at the outset, and going through the pilot groups, 3 were successful, 2 were mid, and 1 was a failure, focus on the winners. There are lots of ways to communicate a rollout to your organization, but there are additional tools that are supplied through Viva that are an example, not the example, but an example for how to introduce the availability of Copilot to your organization and how to connect those people to the right resources. So Viva Amplify is a system for corporate communications, and it allows you to take one message and send it to the right distribution lists or the right communities, the right Teams channels, and the right emails. Microsoft provides, that I'll show you momentarily, pre-built campaigns to introduce Copilot to an organization. Viva Learning is a system that can expose a selected curriculum to people through their browser and through Teams. And you can use it for lots of things. There are lots of online courses and education providers and lots of reasons why you need to focus on learning and development in your organization. But Viva Learning includes pre-built resources to introduce people to Copilot, and you can extend it with your own resources. If you have built videos or PowerPoints, those can also be added. And there's further resources available that you may sample at adoption.microsoft.com. They've done a really good job of publishing all that information. So let's take a quick look at what those deployment resources look like. And so first, Amplify. So Viva Amplify is a baseline communications tool that allows me to build a structured program. Think of something like an employee benefit sign-up period. It also gets used a lot for regular project communications. If you're at all like me, well-intentioned, but looking for the path of least resistance, a little lazy. I don't want to remember all the places I have to tell and engage people. I want to write one message and use that one composition to get to as many people as possible. So Viva Amplify lets me do that. I compose one message and it gets posted out to news, to news on SharePoint, to Teams, to email, and to a community supported by Viva Engage. If I want to build a new campaign, Microsoft has a couple of pre-built campaigns that are out there, one of which is Copilot. And rather than download it, I've already got this set up here. Let's cancel out. Cancel anyway. There we go. And so the ready to send campaign is the Copilot Deployment Kit. When this comes up, come on up. It is still thinking about it. I love when my computer knows that people are watching and it's being impatient. So this has a series of pre-built communications. For instance, if I look at Get Ready for Copilot in Microsoft 365, this is a pre-built, pre-structured communication. And I can decide where I want to roll this out. And I can customize this further. So it's saying, get ready, this is coming, start simple. It provides guidance, it provides resources. You can also add your own links, and you should. If you want your team to be able to know where to go to get help, that should integrate with what your help desk system. If you have other resources that you developed in the pilot that you found useful, this is a great way to get it in front of people. And this, again, is a structured program. And you may augment this further, but to be able to decide across the scope of it, here's how it's going to run across Microsoft 365. Here's how it runs in Teams. Here's how it runs in Word. Here in PowerPoint, in Outlook, and in Excel, so that each week, as you're exposing people to it, you have a set of pre-built resources that will help people be successful with it. Those are good on the input, but they also may have further questions that are addressed by Viva Learning. So looking at Viva Learning, this is the home screen, and you can see in our running example, by the way, we have a couple of custom courses that we've built for ourselves that we publish to the organization. One of the things in Viva Learning is the idea of an academy. So there are lots of ways to search for and group suggested courses, whether they're by custom providers like LinkedIn Learning across Microsoft 365. If you were subscribing to things like Critical Path and some other publishers, you can plug them in here as well. Microsoft makes available a whole thing called the Copilot Academy. And so the Copilot Academy is a pre-built set of courses that someone can use to be introduced, look at things like responsible AI, how do I use chat, how do I do the right things with prompting, How can I optimize my time across the organization? And this is just there and it's curated, and you can make this available to people across the organization. You can also use Viva Learning to recommend classes to people to be able to push them out. So when they come to their home screen, they'll get a reminder that's out there. And again, Viva Learning, you can also bundle sets of classes and deploy them to custom tabs inside Teams or distribute recommendations over email. Lots of options. I'm just trying to introduce you to some of the things to think about as you're moving through your planning. Okay. Office hours are really important during this because there are going to be a lot of ad hoc questions. People need to know where to go. And again, those use cases, focus on the priority ones, pick the winners. Microsoft keeps coming up with newer and newer things, agents and Copilot Studio, and you're going to get lots of questions. Limit the scope creep. And once you're moving beyond the pilot, also expect that you're going to be dealing with users who may be less willing, a little more resistant to change. They're not the eager beavers who signed up at the outset, but as you're going, figure out a way to celebrate wins at the individual level and at the team level. On to close out. The purpose of all of this is to get things into a steady state for production. And so here, you want to make sure that the rollout has been evaluated, matched to the initial use cases. Your rollout team and your steerco should be looking at the success of this based on achieving those use case results. The lessons that you capture need to go into 2 or 3 places based on your structure. First, if you have a center of excellence, or if you're establishing one, a group which is going to be charged with ongoing imagination, optimization, being able to continuously innovate, that's one place where those lessons need to go. Closely related to COP, a community of practice. If you were using things like Viva Engage to establish user communities, knowing what the most frequently asked questions were from the pilot and through the rollout phase, it's a great place to make sure that you're structuring those areas in ways that will capture new users who may be joining Copilot well after your rollout phase. And also making sure that the most common questions are being handed back to your support team. And across all of this, you've done a lot of work. You need to celebrate that success. At the end of that success, hopefully, you and your team and your steerco can celebrate and take a break somewhere. Okay. So again, 5 steps in the pilot project, from preparation, content readiness, the pilot itself, rollout, and then handing off to closeout. Each one has a specific goal. Each one has different stakeholders. Each one has different activities. But again, the investment you make in structuring the way that you approach a Copilot rollout will have immediate and long-term benefits to achieving the success that Microsoft promises and that is achievable and within reach. So we're just about wrapped up here. I know we're approaching the end of time. A couple of resources that Microsoft that Synozur has published. You can learn more about everything that Synozur does on AI strategy and design at aka.synozur.com/AI. We also make some free workshops available to help you get started thinking through and planning. You can do that. We've published white papers that are out there and available. A little bit separately from AI, but we talked something about the tools, especially with Viva, about what does a digital workplace look like? What does employee experience look like? That's another area where we have expertise, also in conjunction with one of our favorite partners, Acumatica. So we'll be doing a podcast with them coming up in about 2 weeks with Ed Rogers, the CEO of Acumatica, and Michelle Caldwell, CEO of Synozur, looking at what digital workplace means in 2025 in the era of AI. We're going to follow it up with a webinar with those 2 next month, and you can sign up for those updates at synozur.com. So that said, really want to thank everyone for taking time with us this morning. Let's take a pause here, Michelle, and see what questions may have come in on the Q&A.
We are free and clear on the Q&A, Chris.
Okay. So this is going to be the going once, going twice moment. But if you have a question, feel free to add it in the chat. We've had great attendance here this morning. Really encouraged by all of this. Want to thank you. Want to thank the rest of the Synozur team for helping make today's webinar available. We hope you found it successful. I'm vamping as long as I can to see if there's any more questions that come through. and we don't have any. So that's wonderful. That means I've answered everything. We know that we haven't, but if there's a question that occurs to you, after we share the deck and share the video with you, if you have further questions, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to take them offline. Thank you very much. That's going to conclude this morning's webinar.